In part one of this video, I showed you how to go from zero to full source control of a model-driven PowerApp using the Sparkle Task Runner. In that video, we go from an empty solution to the projects that you see here. In this video, we're going to add deployment automation with the package deployer project, show you how you can then use the configuration migration tool to install data into your target environment, and finally show you how you can bring it all into Visual Studio Team Services, or TFS, to perform build and deployment automation. The Dynamics 365 SDK, now referred to as the developer guide, has a section called Deploy Packages using Dynamics CRM Package Deployer and PowerShell. This shows you how to use a tool that you can download from NuGet to take the solution package you've built and add additional things like data imports, custom code execution, etc., as part of an orchestrated install process. This happens to also be the same engine that's used for independent software vendors who are deploying custom-built applications to Microsoft AppSource. And in order to use that tool, you have to create a package. When you go to this documentation, it walks you through how to use Visual Studio and goes into great detail about all the different things that you can do with Package Deployer. I'm going to show you a very quick walkthrough of what this documentation covers. All right, so to get started, you need to have a Dynamics 365 extension from the marketplace installed. And that's called the Dynamics CRM SDK templates. Once you have that installed, if you right click and say add new project, go to CRM SDK templates, select CRM package, and I'd like to call this thing deployment package. Click OK. And what this does is it basically gives you a .NET class library. What we'll focus on is the package folder and the package template.cs. There's much more that you can do here, but we're just going to focus on the basic process of importing a solution package, importing configuration and/or sample data, as well as the basic code hooks, where you can execute your own code. So to get started, we're going to take a look at the import config.xml. To keep things simple, we're going to come in here and just delete some of the boilerplate stuff. And we're going to rename the solution package file name to this. I'm also going to come in and manage the NuGet packages and make sure we have the latest SDK assemblies. Okay, now if we build this, see that the build succeeded. And I'm going to go ahead and open the folder and explore. And to test this out, we need to use the actual package deployer tool. And you get that through downloading the Dynamics 365 or now Common Data Service SDK. If you click over to the developer documentation here, you click on Developer Tools, you'll see this link, Download Tools from NuGet. This gives you a nice little PowerShell script. You can either download the individual tools, and you'll see that the package deployer tool is there, or you can use this PowerShell script to download them all at once. I've already done that. So we go to package deployment. You'll see that you have this directory here of a set of a .NET executable and a bunch of .NET assemblies. So what I like to do is I like to keep that folder pristine, create a new one for the deployment package I'm trying to deploy. So this thing, we'll call it SC demo. Copy all the contents of this into SC demo. Then you go into the bin debug, and you don't need all these assemblies, you just need the DLL. So if I copy this, I'm sorry, copy that and the package folder and paste it, we're almost ready. The next thing we need is we actually need the zip file. So we'll go into our solution package directory, copy that zip file. Now if we come back up here and we launch package deployer, click continue, it's going to read that XML file. We can connect to the common data service here, and I can really just kind of pick any one of these. Let's select that one. And at this point, you may be thinking to yourself, how is this any different than just using the web user interface to import a zip file? And you would be correct. Right now, what I'm showing you is nothing different other than using a client tool to do the same thing. Having said that, what we'll do next is we'll build on showing how you can then add additional things that you can't do through the web UI to create essentially an installer for your end-to-end application, where you can do things like install multiple solution packages in a particular order, install data, execute pre and post deployment and data import actions, etc. All right, now, of course, this is all the generic text that's in the default template. You would certainly, if you are using this as a UI install process, you would certainly want to change this information and put more description. But basically what it's going to do is connect to this Dynamics 365 instance or Common Data Service environment. And so now that we have this in a client tool that has a deployment engine with code hooks, let's go back to Visual Studio and let's go back to that package template. And again, I won't go into great detail all the different hooks that are here. That's an exercise to go through the documentation. But a common one that's used is after primary import, which basically says after the one or many solution files, and by the way, you can have multiple solution files installed in order. So this could be something else .zip, right? And you can order them. So if you have like base solutions, etc. But in this case, I just want to show how we can hit this breakpoint. And now that we have access to code, we can do all sorts of interesting things. We can execute essentially any .NET code at different parts of the deployment process to do things that aren't possible with solution packages alone. So if I say debug, attach to process, and over here, we just want to look for the word package. There's the package deployer exe. We'll go ahead and attach to that. All right, now we're ready. If I click next, what this is going to do, it's going to take the solution. It's going to, well, at this point, it's reading the XML file, preparing for the installation orchestration of all the things that we tell the package deployer to do. In this case, it's really just going to import a solution package, and then we'll obviously hit this breakpoint where no code will execute. So when I click next, as you can expect, it's going to start to import that solution into my organization. And this takes a while, so I'll probably edit out the delay in the video just so you don't have to sit there and watch. But if you're doing this kind of step by step yourself, when I do that, it's probably a good time to pause the video. All right, so the solution loaded. Now it's publishing the customizations of the managed solution. And again, if you had imported multiple solutions, it would import and publish those in the proper order. All right, now the solution has been imported, and you can see that we've hit that after primary import breakpoint. So not only can you implement advanced deployment scenarios and have full access to not only the Dynamics SDK, but coordination of really anything you can call to from .NET code. You can debug it all in your local environment. And while I showed you how to do this with a UI tool, I'll show you later in the video how you can use the exact same engine in build and deployment automation in a more DevOps style process using something like Visual Studio Team Services or Team Foundation Server. So what are the kinds of things you might want to do as a larger deployment orchestration? So I'm going to transition to a little bit of a side demo and bring in a project that I already have out on GitHub for people to use. And really what it is it's an example of using the same package deployer technology to deploy a Power BI report in conjunction with a Dynamics 365 or Common Data Service based solution. And so if I double click on package template here, you'll see that after primary import, I have this Power BI deployer.deploy call. And if you look at the Power BI deployer, what does it do? It reads a JSON config file that I've created that's got a bunch of information in it, and it uses that to automate the deployment of this Power BI file down here, which ultimately just uses the Power BI REST API to execute some .NET code and then publish some customizations. Again, it's a little bit of a side demo. You can find this Power BI example on github.com, dev-keydet, and it is called CDS Package Deployer Power BI. All right, back to our regularly scheduled program. So next what we want to do is we want to show an example of sample data. So in import config here, we have this attribute CRM MIG data import file. And this is one of the many different ways you can import data into your Dynamics 365 instance or your Common Data Service environment. And in this case, this is using another tool in the SDK that we'll bring up here called configuration migration. And again, the way that you get this is using NuGet, like I had previously shown you. So the way this tool works, it allows you to point to an instance that you already have data in, pull that data down into a zip file that can be reused to insert data into a new environment, including lookup data, reference data, configuration data, things that aren't in the solution package. And it also happens to be a very nice utility to if you're building a demo or you just have some, sample data or initial data that you want to ingest into an application deployment as part of that deployment process. So in order to use that, let's go back over to our solution, and I'm going to add an app here just so we have some navigation in the UI. I'll just call this my app, and we'll add our sample entity, make sure it's on the sitemap. And we'll just quickly make that available. So it's an entity. Let's select that entity, save and close that, save and close that. There's my app. We also want to make sure that we have that sitemap that we just created inside of the solution package. So let's go ahead and add an existing sitemap. There it is. We'll save it and publish our customizations. All right, now if we go and refresh this. We should have an app in our navigation here. All right, there it is, my app. There's a navigation for samples. We can come in here, we can create a couple pieces of data. Before we do that, we just made a bunch of changes to the system. So let's go back to our solution package. Let's commit these changes first, and we'll say added deployment package. All right, so we checked those changes in, or committed those changes locally. Old habits die hard, I still say check in. Now I can come over here to my solution package and I can run unpack. That'll pull down the app and the sitemap that we just created. Get that into source control. All right, and as we can see, what's changed. So we can look at the solution. We can see what's added there. We can look at the customizations. We can see what's added there. And of course, we have the app module and the sitemap. All right, so we can say added app module and sitemap. Commit those. All right, so we've got everything that's up on my development environment now in source control. Let's switch back to the configuration migration tool, and let's use it to export some data. Click continue. That's the wrong one, so let's call this. And I will use it to connect to, what did I type wrong here? Let's see. I'll use it to connect to my development environment. This one. And before we do that, we actually have to create some data. So let's come in here and let's create a new one. One, two, two, three. That should be enough. All right, so we've got three pieces of data and we want to export this. And again, I'm going to show you a very rudimentary example. This tool is pretty powerful once you understand your data model, um, and you know what data you need to pull down and all the related entities, etc. It's smart enough to pull things down in the right order and do multiple passes and all sorts of interesting things. But for now, we're just going to pull down. Oh, I did that wrong. If you don't have a schema, you have to create the schema first. So let's do that again. All right, we'll select the solution that we're working in, SC demo, and the entity, and we'll add the whole entity. Again, if you have lots of things, you can add multiple things. There's lots of advanced activities you can do. You can configure import settings. You can disable plugins on all entities for import. In fact, let's go ahead and do that for this one, because I do have a plugin that fires when I import this data, although that plugin does nothing, as you saw from the previous video. And then we can call save and export. All right, now I'll just put this in downloads. We'll call this SC demo. Do you want to export the data? You say yes. And we'll save this again to downloads. We'll call this C demo underscore data. And this will take the data out of your Dynamics 365 instance or your common data service environment and pull it down into a zip file. We can go ahead and close that. If I go to downloads here, and if you open this up, you'll see it's just some XML files. So what I like to do is copy those files and put the raw files in source control. So let's get that set up. So let's go up one, create a new folder, and I just call this, you can call it whatever you want. I like to call it sample data or initial data. Let's call it that. Initial data. And I'll paste those files in there. And then of course, if we go back to Visual Studio, do the same thing we did before, add existing website, go to initial data, click open. And now you can kind of take a look at what the XML files look like that represent the schema and the data of this. And again, in general, whether it be the solution package or the sample data, it's usually not a great idea to manually edit these XML files. You're much better off and safer using the tools to generate the latest versions of those XML files. But if you really know what you're doing and you're willing to know that changing XML files may break imports and that sort of thing, if you enter a typo, etc., you can come in here and make changes to those files. But again, just like everything else now, we can see what's changed over time, what sample data, what sample schema, etc., or initial data and initial schema have we entered into source control, right? So I'll go ahead and added initial data files for import. All right, so then to get the package deployer to use this, we have to come into import config. We need to give this file a name. And as you notice, I'm not going to build these XML files at build time, but what I will show you later on is how in Visual Studio Team Services, you can just zip up these files as a build process and a deployment process. For me, it's easy enough just to use the zip file that was created. We're really just putting these individual files in for visibility and transparency and change management. But I've got that local zip file, and that local zip file was called SC demo data. So let's rename that just to get the text copy, put it over here. Then let's copy this, put it back in our same package deployer folder. And then over here, let's go to our deployment package. Let's make sure we save all this and build it in Visual Studio. All right, so we'll go to bin, debug like we did before, and we want the latest DLL and the package folder. We'll place those destination files. And this time around, when we run package deployer, it should import that data. So let's log in. All right, so we'll click next, next. This time, since we're doing a data import, it's going to initialize threads. So it's smart enough to do data import in a multi-threaded fashion based on its understanding of data relationships and what data can be imported in parallel. But you'll see that it found that data import this time around. It's going to skip the solution import because it's the same version number. So it just assumes that there's no changes if that version already exists. And then it's going to start the import process. So look at the schema, understand the relationships. In this case, we have one thing to import, so it was really simple. Finish. All right, so we've augmented what we have in source control by adding a deployment package and initial or sample data and automating the deployment of the solution package and that sample data together. Let's go ahead and update it, call this updated to import sample data, and we'll commit all. All right, so we've done a bunch of stuff locally in Visual Studio. Now I want to show you how we can take this into something like Visual Studio Team Services or Team Foundation Server and do build and deployment automation from that service. So first thing we need to do is take our local changes and publish them. So we'll come over here. I've already got the account that I'm using. We'll paste the URL of my Git repo. So to kind of give some context, I've got an empty Visual Studio Team Services project here that we're going to be using for the purposes of this demo. Now, if you're not familiar with Visual Studio Team Services, I certainly recommend you go take a look. It's Microsoft's service that empowers people to implement DevOps practices. So it's got source control and build and release automation and test automation and work item tracking, etc. So we'll come back to Visual Studio here, and I've put this URL here, and I just want to publish this code to that remote repository. All right, so my push failed because perhaps maybe this is either a bug or something I wasn't familiar with in Team Explorer, but I had to come in here and make sure that I was connected. So if I click on Manage Connections, I came in and made sure I was connected to the right repo. Now if I come in over here and I go back to my changes, I should be able to push them. All right, so now if I come over to here and I click on code, you'll see that all my code and all my commits are in source control now. All right, so let's go over to builds. And we want to create a new build definition. And we will base that off of this Git repository. And we want to, every time things are pushed into master, so we just want this build to build off of master in this case. We'll take a .NET desktop, click apply. And I'll name this master because I like to call my build based on the branch it's building off of. Your mileage may vary. We're not doing testing, so we can disable this task. You should certainly consider doing unit testing of both your .NET code and your JavaScript code, but for now, to keep this walkthrough simple, we're not going to do test automation or validation of tests during the build. And the first thing we want to do is add a new task. And this is going to be the pack solution task. And notice that I already have some tasks installed. The way I got these tasks is I went to Visual Studio Marketplace and I looked for Dynamics 365 build tools. Once you install those, you'll have these tasks available to you. So if you're kind of walking through this video step by step, now might be a good time to pause, go install those, and come back. But we'll add the pack solution. The SDK version we do want is 9.0. The folder for the unpacked files is our deployment package. Sorry, not our deployment package, our solution package folder. We need a mapping file. Now, remember when we were using SPKL, it was kind of doing the mapping for us. It was essentially hiding this map.xml file nuance for us. So we're going to have to go into Visual Studio and create that mapping file. So we'll come back to our solution package and create a file called map.xml. And the format of this file is documented in the solution package or documentation I showed you in the previous video. I'm going to use that format here and paste it in from another project that I have. And what you'll notice is if you look at map.xml and sparkle.json, the formats are very similar, right? The difference here is that sparkle.json kind of generates this map.xml on the fly locally. And when we're on the VSTS servers, this task expects it in the XML format. So what we're going to do here is we're just going to make sure that map.xml looks like sparkle.json. So we'll come over here. We'll change this from file to file to file to path. And we're going to map from plugin assemblies to my plugins. Clean up the double slashes here. And that should otherwise look the same, right? We've got that mapping to web resources, mapping to web resources, we should be good. So of course we've got to check this into source control, added map.xml, commit that. Get it up to our Git repository in VSTS. All right, we can now come back here and we can find that mapping file. So under solution package, there's map.xml. And the path we need is going to be the build artifacts staging directory, which is a reserved variable in VSTS. So we basically want to take the output of this task, that zip file, and put it into deployment package, bin, release, package folder, because that's the same location that the build is going to put the output of our package deployer project. So similarly, we want to zip up the sample data and put it in the same location. So we'll select the archive files task and we'll just call this zip initial data. So we want to grab from the initial data directory, that's the source. Don't want to prepend root folder name to the archive paths. Archive type is a zip. And then very similarly, we want to grab this same output path and put it here. And the file name needs to match what was in Visual Studio, which is this right here. And so again, the solution will get packed on the server and it'll get that zip file will get copied over to the same directory that the package deployer binaries are brought to, staging us for deployment automation. Similarly, the zip file for initial data will get copied to the same location, staging us for deployment automation. So we're doing a build, which is taking all of the assets in source control and bringing them into their deployable form. Now, one more thing I just realized is you can say update version here by this using this task, and you can include the version in the file name to keep things simple, right? I'm going to change something here. I'm going to change this to scdemo.zip, save, and this will give us an opportunity to show deployment automation, build automation when things get pushed into master. So I'm going to come back over here. So this file is going to end up being called scdemo.zip. right? And we know that because if we come into the solution, it's going to use the name of the solution to name the zip file. Again, if we wanted to include the file name in the version or the version in the file name, we could, but that sort of adds complexity into the build process. So I'm keeping it simple and just naming it the same thing every time we create a new build. All right, with that, we should be able to save and queue the build. And we can take a look at the build. And watch it as it processes. In the interest of time, I will edit out a lot of the overall build process and just call out some things as the build progresses. All right, so the way VSTS works is it downloads the tasks each time to the host agent because the host agent is stateless. So it's downloading all those tasks. It's getting the code from Git onto the build server. Next, it's going to do a NuGet restore. So the .NET projects, namely the plugin and the package deployer, reference the DLLs from NuGet. So it pulls those down from NuGet because again, you don't check in DLLs to source control. That's sort of a general practice now. People don't like to put binaries in source control. NuGet's restoring those things. Once the NuGet restore is complete, we'll build the solution. So the package deployer DLL as well as the .NET plugin DLL will get built. All right, now that the .NET DLLs are built, the CRM solution gets packed, the sample data gets zipped up, or the initial data gets zipped up, and then all of this gets copied to a location that can then be used for release or deployment automation. So if we actually look at this build now, we go check out the artifacts and explore the drop location, we'll see now in bin, release, package folder, we have the solution package zip file, the data zip file, all in the right location. So now all of this stuff can be used in a deployment automation process. But remember, I made a change over here to the import config to make sure it used the right name for the file. Right? We changed that. We need to get that in for the deployment automation process to work. So I'll go ahead and commit my changes and we'll say changed file name, commit all. Now before we push this up to our remote repository, let's go back into VSTS and let's edit the build definition here and change the trigger to be continuous integration. Right? So what this is saying is anytime changes are brought into the master branch, kick off a build. And so depending on how your team works, you may work on features in a separate branch, and then once they're ready, submit a pull request into master, for example. There's all sorts of approaches. I just wanted to kind of show that continuous build where the build will actually get kicked off based on the fact that I've put changes into master. All right, so now if I come back to Visual Studio and we push those into master, I'm not suggesting you should ever push directly into master. Really is a good idea to do work in branches and use uh, processes like git flow, using pull requests and those sorts of things. But again, in a demonstration like this, you try to keep things simple. All right, so now if we go back to builds, we should see that a build is in progress and it was triggered automatically because changes were pushed into master. All right, so while that's running, let's go and set up a release. So releases are the mechanism in VSTS to do deployment automation. And the good news here is our release is going to be very simple. So I've got an empty process and we'll just call this our test environment. But for example, you could add multiple environments. You could have test and then staging, oh, another empty process, and you could call this staging, and you could set up quality gates and all sorts of things here. And that's a topic that you can read in Visual Studio team services and TFS documentation on how to set all this stuff up, and it's sort of beyond the scope of what I'm trying to show in this video. Just kind of wanted to tease that out. And so what we're going to do is we're going to create a release off of source control. So in this case, we're going to create it off of master. We want the latest code. Click add. And then we could create, for example, a trigger. We can make this, I'm sorry, we can create a trigger over here to say, you know, kick off this continuous deployment trigger every time we get a new build created. In this case, I'm going to keep it simple, and we're going to make this manual. And then over here, um, this will happen when a release is created. The real meat of this is to come in here and do your deployment automation. Now, the good news is because we are using package deployer, the deployment automation is really simple. We come in here, we select add, and then we have to set up a few different values. This gets a little bit more complicated to set up, and I like to show how you can do things like set up connection strings using variables, etc. And so to walk you through doing this from scratch is a little bit more involved. So instead of doing that, what I'm going to do is show you an example of one that I've done for a different project. And so this is an example based on that Power BI package deployer sample I showed you previously. And if we come in here and we look at the tasks, you can see how the deploy package task uses a variable, right? And so what I like to do is I like to come in here and compose a dynamics connection string and then use variables to compose those, right? So you can see here, this value is actually composed of other variable values being injected into the string. And so it'll get username from down here, and username gets user from here, and tenant from here, gets the URL from there, which uses, again, the domain from here, gets the password from here, which is, I'm using Visual Studio's ability to protect this. You can also take this to the next level and put these secrets in Key Vault and use them from Visual Studio. But once you've got that set up, then you just give the name of the DLL that gets built for the package, and then the directory that that DLL is sitting in. And so that takes a lot more time to get set up. I'm not going to walk through how to set that up, but if you want to see an example of that, you can just go to GitHub, dev-keydet, and inside my Power BI example, in the VSTS folder, you can see under release, you can actually import this JSON file into VSTS, and then I will have already set up most of this work for you, right? So how would you do that? You would come in over here, and we'll just put some bad values in here for now and click save. But you come in here and you can import a release definition, and I can browse, for example, to see GitHub dev-keydet, and I can grab that same file, open it, and import it. And there's some things that you're gonna have to fix. So this task isn't installed, but for this example, we actually don't use this task. We're really just using this task. And then we can come in here and we can set up our variables. So the deployment package DLL is the same, right? I use the same similar naming convention. So this would just work now. So if we come in here in variables, I'm going to go ahead and pause and update these values. I don't actually need these. And then we just need to point to the right agent queue, save this. Okay. Of course, you would want to change your dynamics domain to something that works. So in my case, I'll pick one over here, say DKDT Insider. So we'll change that. My tenant is Mark SC. My user is Mark SC. That should all just work. And then I'll call this master release. Click save. I go to all our definitions. We can go ahead and delete this definition that we had started. And then we can go ahead and, assuming that the build is complete, which it should be, yep, it succeeded. So we can go to releases and we can go ahead and create a new release. Oh, we have to fix one more thing. So if we come over here and we edit, actually I have to point to a legitimate release or little legitimate artifact here. So we have to recreate this. And then in this case, the trigger is not going to be continuous, and this trigger is just based after release. So if I manually create a release, it will then deploy to this environment. And again, you could add additional environments, right? You can chain them, etc. But we're not going to do that. We'll just save this, and we will create a release. Very similar to the build. Now we can go take a look at the release. It'll get queued up on the agent. It's in progress, so we can come over here to the logs. We had an error, so what's the error? The package file not specified or found. So likely in my release, we've got some sort of typo. Let's edit this. So let's find the package directory. Make sure we just don't have it wrong. So deployment package bin release. So that's right there. Okay, so the naming here was wrong. That was master build. The actual path package directory was incorrect. So this time, if we save it and we set the directory correctly, again, to the point of sometimes it's a little bit of trial and error getting this stuff up and running. But if we save this and create another release, go check out that release. This time around, we should have a successful deployment. So it's in progress. Let's go look at the logs. And again, in the interest of time, I'll edit as much of this out so you're not just staring at a screen with no narration. All right, so this time we can see that the build succeeded and the package deployment succeeded. All right, and so in summary, in the first video, we showed you how to get your entire application, including your point and click configurations, into source control. In this second video, we then showed you how to do deployment automation with package deployer to be able to import one or many solution files as well as sample data. We showed you how to test and debug it locally. Right? And that sample data that we used was using the configuration migration tool that's part of the SDK. And since all of that's in source control, we showed you how to then take it to the next level. And from Visual Studio Team Services, create a build that goes through and takes all of the assets in source control and transforms them, right? Builds them into their deployable forms, namely .NET DLLs, ultimately a CRM solution package, and an initial data zip file. It then gets copied over to a location that can be picked up by a release for deployment automation. I then showed you how you can use the release to pull the artifacts from the master build and then use the deploy package task as a mechanism to execute the package deployer engine from within VSTS. So the deployment is really simple because of all of the work that we had done leading up to this end state. And what this task does is it just executes, much like the UI tool you saw me walk through, the executable, the package deployer executable. This does it in a headless fashion, right? Without any UI, it does the same thing, and it will go and it will look into the package folder directory. It'll look for, first it'll look for this DLL, right? That is the starting point. Then it'll read the XML file. The XML file specifies to import this zip file and then, which is the solution package, and then import the sample data. And of course, you can evolve this and get more robust once you start to look at the package deployer documentation. And again, I think I mentioned this before in the video, but this whole package deployer process is also the same engine that is used in Microsoft AppSource for deploying Dynamics 365 or now moving forward Common Data Service code to a target environment. So if you're doing all this in your development environment and you're doing it the way I've showed you how to do it, you are now in a position to take exactly what you've built and submit it to AppSource to be available for others to use. So if you're not familiar with AppSource, if you go to appsource.com. It'll redirect to appsource.microsoft.com. And there are a set of Dynamics 365 or moving forward, I'm sure this will be rebranded Common Data Service based applications, or maybe not rebranded, but there might be a separate refined by product for Common Data Service. But these are all the things that can be deployed on today on top of Dynamics 365 using that same package deployer engine that I mentioned before. And so if you've followed the approach I've showed in these last two videos, when you click on List on App Source and you start to review the documentation, you will be way ahead of those who aren't familiar with how to do all these things. And the last mile of getting your stuff submitted to AppSource should be relatively simple. If not, if your end goal is not to publish your solution onto AppSource, that's totally fine. What you've learned end to end is how to enable granular change management of your application using source control, build, and deploy automation.